Okay, I think we can start. Welcome to everybody to the final session of this Humanitas series on statecraft and diplomacy. And once again, it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Helen Clark, who I think by this stage, a couple of days in, we don't need too much of introduction. But once again, I'll just thank the Institute for Strategic Dialogue for making this series possible, and to say how much we've enjoyed having Helen with us. So I won't get a chance to say that at the end in a proper way, and to thank her for not only the words of wisdom, but for the generosity in which she's entered discussion with us over these 2 days. And I'm very much looking forward to your final paper.
Thank you.
And I should say we are being live streamed as usual. There is Twitter coming in, and apparently we got 10 million. We had 10 million people.
Impressions.
10 million impressions on our discussion. So be careful what you say.
Well, thank you to our chair, and thank you again to all who've made the lecture series and the symposium possible. I've really enjoyed it. The symposium this morning with distinguished people talking about various aspects of development diplomacy was really fantastic. And we enjoyed the Twitter chat. I think there's a huge interest in sustainable development at the moment with the lead up to the Rio +20 conference. I'm going to talk a bit about that tonight. And we did get to 10 million plus impressions, which is quite large as our Twitter chats go. So last night's lecture, I took apart the concept of building resilience and how important that was for sustaining development. But for tonight, I've got a focus on the broader concept of sustainable development. And I want to look at how it's sort of evolved into development discourse in the UN-led discussions around development, and the sort of things one can do to take sustainable development from being an exciting concept to actually happening in practice. It is hard achieving sustainable development, which may account for not enough progress being made, but there's certainly ways of tackling it. And as I said, in the run-up to Rio +20, this is a very, very timely topic. Rio +20, of course, refers to 20 years on from the groundbreaking Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And it is an opportunity to get a wide range of sectors, disciplines, players thinking about what are the drivers of integrated decision-making. And I guess if we're speaking at a centre like this one, which is interdisciplinary, cross-discipline, you appreciate the complexity of working across silos, whatever the subject. But we are compelled to try to do this with development because of the urgency of the challenges which the world confronts, which I will say a little about, and take perhaps as my guiding statement a quote from Brazil's President Dilma Rousseff, who said recently in a speech on the road to Rio that, quote, "Not only is it possible to grow and to include, protect and conserve at the same time, but also truly sustainable development requires that we do just that." So let me talk a little about the background and evolution on UN thinking about development. Go back to 1945 when the UN Charter was written. Written from the conviction that through working together, the world's nations could overcome human misery, avoid bloodshed, and lay the ground for a more prosperous and peaceful world. And the Charter established the 3 overarching objectives of the United Nations, the pillars of peace, human rights, and development: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm the faith in fundamental human rights, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. Those are the words of the 1945 Charter. Then in 1951, the UN called for international action to accelerate the rate of development in poor countries. It set up what were the forerunners of the UN Development Programme, which I head today, which were the expanded Programme of Technical Assistance and the UN's Special Fund for Economic Development. These were established in the 1950s. But when you look at the discourse of those times, there's not much that suggests that the environmental sustainability of established models of development, such as those followed in this country, my own country, elsewhere, was a concern. However, if we fast forward to 1972 and the United Nations World Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, this began to come very much onto the agenda. And there's to be a conference in Stockholm, indeed, next week, Stockholm plus 40, 40 years since the World Conference on the Human Environment. But when that conference was being prepared, it actually was met with quite a lot of criticism and suspicion from countries which viewed environmental protection as a threat to their industrialisation and their economic modernisation. And there are still, of course, resonance of that debate to this very day. However, the Stockholm Conference worked to turn those concerns on their head by presenting development as a cure for environmental problems, not as the cause of the problems. And it connected problems of poverty with environmental degradation. So unsafe drinking water, inadequate housing, ill health, all manifestations of poverty linked to environmental degradation. And it's following the 1972 conference that a number of countries began to establish for the first time environmental ministries. I think in my own country, the environmental ministry goes back to exactly this era. And from Stockholm, also, the substantial body of international environmental law as we know it today grew, and the UN Environment Programme was created as the first multilateral agency concerned exclusively with the national environment. From 1972 through to 1987, the then Secretary-General asked Gro Harlem Brundtland, Prime Minister of Norway, if she would chair a World Commission on Environment and Development. And the Brundtland report has gone into the lexicon as an incredibly important report in the journey on sustainable development, and gave us the concept of sustainable development we generally use to this day: development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, exhorting us to find ways of advancing human progress which don't fundamentally undermine the ecosystems of the one planet we have to live on. And I guess for me and the organisation I lead, we see achieving sustainability as not being about trading off economic, social and environmental objectives against each other, but rather how can we pursue these objectives simultaneously, looking for policies which achieve multiple objectives. And I want to say a bit more about this as I go along. But you can, for example, stimulate employment and reduce poverty through the act of reducing environmental degradation. Take, for example, reforestation in Haiti, which is rather important in the medium to longer term in reducing poverty. But the reverse is also true. If you degrade the environment, you undermine your prospects, economic and social, and Haiti's vanished forests might be another good example of that. So the ideas about development which did not compromise the prospects of future generations from the 1987 Brundtland report very much shaped the discussions at the Earth Summit in Rio 5 years later. And that summit attracted more heads of state and government than had ever attended a UN conference before, addressed an unprecedentedly wide set of concerns across the pillars of sustainable development, and attracted record numbers of actively engaged and empowered non-governmental organisations. Some of those same tensions seen at Stockholm about concern of, if we do this, will it compromise our modernisation and development, was still heard. But the conference attempted to balance developing and developed countries' interests by stating that human beings at the centre of sustainable development are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. Now, this suggested that sustainable development was beginning to merge with another evolution in development thinking around this time. The human development approach, which UNDP has done a great deal to advance with many distinguished collaborators. From the earliest stage, Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate, his collaborator Mahbub al-Haq, and so many others over the past 22 years. And the human development paradigm was very much about putting people firmly at the centre of development, and defined development broadly as a process of enlarging people's choices to live lives they value, and argued that this must be about much more than just the expansion of income and wealth. The very first Global Human Development Report, published by UNDP in 1990, began with the words, "People are the real wealth of a nation," and introduced the Human Development Index, which did not accept that you could measure progress by GDP per capita alone. That was the conventional measurement of progress, but it added to that, because income is not irrelevant, but it's not everything, it added to that indicators for education and indicators around health status. Now, that was groundbreaking in 1990, but today this kind of thinking is very much part of the mainstream development discourse. So you've got sustainable development starting to work its way into the UN-led development thinking from the early 70s. You've got the human development paradigm pushed forward from 1990. But how have we done on endeavouring to tie together human development, equity and sustainability? Well, again, Amartya Sen and his collaborators were writing about the need to link these concepts back in the early 1990s. And the Brundtland Report also foreshadowed those links. Quite an interesting quote we've taken from that, where the report notes that unless inequity and injustice are tackled, industry may be able to get away with unacceptable levels of water pollution, because the people who bear the brunt of that are poor and unable to complain. Forests may be destroyed by excessive felling because the people living there have no alternatives, or because timber contractors have more influence than forest dwellers. Not an uncommon story. So those links were being made going back quite a lot of years, but so often we find that discussions about sustainable development tend to rest quite heavily on the environmental pillar. It is a very important pillar, but often the discussion seems to neglect the economic and the social pillars. And I think it is extremely important that all these three dimensions are addressed at Rio Plus 20. And the report of the Secretary-General's high-level panel on global sustainability, released just a couple of months ago, is quite helpful in this regard, as is the Global Human Development Report released by UNDP last year on equity and sustainability, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. So, moving forward from the Earth Summit of 1992, that summit accelerated agreement on more international legal instruments around the environment. And I'm told that more than 900 of these international legal instruments now exist. And perhaps what we most remember the Earth Summit for is the momentum it gave to the development of the International Conventions on Climate Change, combating desertification, and on biodiversity. And the Global Environment Facility, quite a significant fund for developing countries, was also established at Rio, and at this very time funds well over 2,000 different initiatives in more than 168 countries, around biodiversity protection, climate change adaptation, many aspects of environmental sustainability. The GEF was set up to use UNDP, UN Environment Programme and the World Bank as funding channels, and in our current portfolio around energy, environment, climate, it probably contributes about a fifth of the funding at this time. So we're very active in that area. The Earth Summit was also known for Agenda 21, the action program, which has been a guide to governments, including at the subnational level. In my own country, New Zealand, progressive local governments were very excited about Agenda 21 and used it in their planning processes to endeavour to balance across the dimensions of sustainability. But how much action really have we had since 1992? Well, the Secretary-General's high-level panel, reporting 2 months ago, thinks that, and I quote, "Sustainable development has undoubtedly suffered from a failure of political will and the lack of incentives to put it into practice. And it asserts that this is in part because our policies, our politics and our institutions disproportionately reward the short term." UNDP, reviewing these issues, recently found, and I quote, "There's little challenge to the idea that integrating development and environmental policy can result in cost-effective policy options with benefits across policy areas, but that governments can be reluctant to integrate poverty reduction, social policy, environment policies, because if they do, they may have to make politically risky decisions, fiscally costly shifts in resources in the first instance, and it can take a lot of the time of the most talented public administrators to try and figure all this out. And on the aspect of it being politically risky, I still remain somewhat amazed at the storm that my own opponents in New Zealand managed to cook up about the introduction of the energy-efficient light bulbs and decisions to phase out the old-style bulbs. I mean, this is just so much common sense and obviously the subject of directives in the European Union, but you would think that you were committing a capital offence in New Zealand to suggest this. So you do need to be very determined to put up with all the banter and opposition of quite a low grade around some of these issues. The high-level panel report also suggests that the lack of progress on integrated decision-making stems from sustainable development not yet really getting fully incorporated into the mainstream of decision-making. And they say that when you see occasions which bring people together from across economics profession, environmentalists, poverty, social cause activists, it's often almost as if they were speaking different languages or at least dialects. So we do have a problem in joining the dots here. But why do we have to join the dots? And I come to my third set of points. It actually is rather urgent because the planet is under pressure. And this was precisely the title of a recent conference in London, the Planet Under Pressure conference, where the science advisor to the British government, Sir John Beddington, told the 3,000 people present that the seriousness of the near-term challenges posed by a rapidly increasing population, urbanisation and climate change will force governments to act. And he said they will have to do so if only to meet the needs of their citizens for adequate food, water and economic prospects, even if they are resisting taking steps to address the longer-term questions. And at the expert level, there appears to be rather broad agreement that without urgent action for sustainable development now, the world will move beyond what scientists are terming its planetary boundaries, beyond which point there are a lot of risks to climate, biodiversity, supply of fresh water, and much more. And as was pointed out at the London conference, there are risks which are intensifying economic, ecological and social crises, creating the potential for a humanitarian emergency on a global scale, quote unquote. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report is noting that increases in extreme weather are already a discernible trend, and that together with the depletion of natural resources and more frequent natural disasters does pose a real and increasing threat to development progress. And I think we could see the recurring, more frequently recurring and more intense severe drought in the Sahel, and I guess the Horn as well, and flooding in Pakistan as cases in point. Now, who's most at risk from these trends? Well, every nation is vulnerable, but it's always the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder who face the disproportionate risks, where environmental disaster for their communities can inflict loss of life, loss of livelihood, and put development into reverse gear. The World Health Organization estimates that 23% of all deaths worldwide could be prevented if we could improve in areas like water and sanitation and indoor and outdoor air quality. Preventable diseases directly linked to contaminated water and polluted air alone are claiming the lives of around 3 million children under 5 every year, with fatalities concentrated in Africa and South Asia. Then women are also seen to be disproportionately affected by ecosystem degradation because overall they are poorer, they receive less education, and they're likely to be excluded from political and household decision-making processes affecting their lives. They depend more on natural resources for their livelihoods, and as those resources are depleted, poor women are forced to spend more time fetching water and fuel from further away. And the effect of that can be that the girl child is taken out of school earlier to help carry the burden of the chores, and women's options for economic and other empowerment are closed off further, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So overall, we conclude in UNDP that pursuing environmental sustainability becomes essential also for tackling the vast and unfinished agenda of ending extreme poverty and inequity. Because when the environment is harmed, so too is the potential to lift human development. But the converse is also true. To protect natural resources and reduce environmental stress on the planet, we need to reduce inequity and poverty, which is rather a tall order in the face of the economic and other crises of recent years. Now, last year's Global Human Development Report on Equity and Sustainability constructed scenarios of what our world could look like in human development terms by mid-century. And it did a base case scenario which assumed only limited changes in inequality and environmental threats and risks. And that base case anticipated that the Global Human Development Index could rise by 19% by 2050, and that would represent a rate of progress in lifting human development similar to that we've seen in around the last 2 decades. But then they did 2 other scenarios. One, an environmental challenges scenario, was built, which took into account impact of global warming on agricultural production, challenges related to water, sanitation, pollution, growing inequality and its consequences, such as a higher probability of intrastate conflict. And under that scenario, the increase in the Global Human Development Index was predicted to be 8% lower than in the base case scenario and 12% lower in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So then they went a step further and they modelled an environmental disaster scenario, which amplified the magnitude of the impacts modelled, which is not necessarily unrealistic. And on that scenario, they said the global HDI would be 15% below the base case scenario, with the most dramatic impact of that on sub-Saharan Africa, which would fall 24% below, and on South Asia falling 22% below. Now, the concern about this is it sees human development progress not just slow to a crawl, but actually regress in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And that, I think, indicates to us that there is a compelling need for action to prevent such a scenario materialising. On income inequality, this has become quite a significant global issue, commanding attention at the highest multilateral and national levels. I was interested in the way the discussion around this developed at the Davos World Economic Forum this year. Inequality was the buzzword. It was seen now as threatening the very foundations of capitalism. Actually, I'm rather concerned about inequality in its own right, but it's elevated itself to discussion in such cerebral circles these days. According to a report by Credit Suisse, the world's richest 1% held 43% of the world's total wealth in 2010, with the lowest 50% of income earners holding under 2%. UNICEF has extrapolated that on the trends we've seen since 1990 through to 2007, it would take more than 800 years for the poorest 1 billion people to achieve 10% of global income. This is not fast progress. The inequalities have been exacerbated by the crisis in the global economy, obviously, and what's happened to employment. There is a jobs crisis out there. And not only were more jobs lost to add to the total of more than a couple of 100 million people out of work, but to keep up with new entrants to the labour force over the next decade, another 400 million jobs are needed. And then we're not counting the roughly 30% of the world's workforce living in households where family members live on under $2 a day, which is rather low income. We see many young people, including the highly educated, and not only in developing countries, very much in developed countries too, having poor or no job opportunities and becoming distrustful of institutions and leaders and quite discouraged. And remember that we have the world's largest ever generation of youth at 1.2 billion strong, the overwhelming majority of which live in developing countries. So when we're thinking sustainable development, think also large youth generation, huge shortage of jobs, need to find more ways for people to have sustainable livelihoods. And if you look at how a number of pressures of economic exclusion then come together with political exclusion and denial of rights and dignity, you have the perfect storm which created uprisings in several of the Arab states in recent times. Some studies, including some conducted by my own organisation, suggest that countries with high income polarisation and inequality may be more likely to have social conflict and adopt unsustainable policies because of the influence and preferences of powerful groups, and overall are less likely to invest in policies which are in the wider public interest. Yet, as the world population rises, if inequality expands, if environmental degradation accelerates and old economic models falter, we could see sustainable development, far from being a distant ideal, as an opportunity to address global challenges concurrently. And that opportunity could be taken at Rio Plus 20 to really move this discussion forward. So, what could Rio Plus 20 usefully focus on? Well, in the first place, I think it should focus on what are really some very interesting examples of integrated policy making for a sustainable development. And at UNDP, we've given this the term triple wins. Can you design policies which simultaneously advance economic, social, and environmental goals? Yes, you can, is the short answer. So let me give some examples around that. And I go first to India, which has in recent years adopted a number of rights-based laws which do have the effect of reducing poverty and inequity and boosting environmental protection. And the most dramatic in scale is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. This is the world's largest job creation program. It now benefits some 55 million rural poor households a year. It offers them a minimum number of days work a year, 100 days from recollection, at a set minimum wage level, which cannot be dropped below, with a requirement that at least 1/3 of those employed are women. In practice, the gender quota has been exceeded, with women comprising around 50% of the program's workforce, and around 43% of those involved are from historically disadvantaged groups. Among the objectives set for this giant job creation scheme are conserving natural resources, enhancing environmental services, sustaining food and livestock production, increasing water levels, reducing soil erosion, increasing soil fertility, conserving biodiversity, and sequestering carbon. So the work done on those things is what earns the income which enables people to be lifted out of poverty. It's quite a visionary scheme. I don't want to idealise it, but it is a scheme of great scale, which is demonstrably of benefit to many. Come to another example in Niger, which I've referred to several times on this visit to Cambridge as a country facing very, very severe food security problems right now, and doesn't have a lot of tree cover, and yet trees are a very important asset as windbreaks, protecting crops from sandstorms coming down from the Sahara, helping to keep the moisture in the soils, drawing the nutrients to the topsoil. And so there have been some rather significant locally managed reforestation initiatives, which government has encouraged, and local farmers have reforested about 4% of the country's land area to date. Now, in that 4%, it can be demonstrated that the cereal yields are up by around 100 kilograms a hectare, which is important for food security. Livelihoods thereby improve, probably benefiting around 2.5 million people. Now, if we can get support for expanding these sorts of initiatives, it's incredibly important. And as people saw some villages and farmers doing these things, the idea caught on. It got its own momentum and really demonstrated the power and importance of community engagement and ownership. I did in February go to Niger with Valerie Amos, the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, and known, I guess, in Britain as Baroness Amos, who was the DFID Secretary of State several years ago. And we were very struck by the stark contrast in two villages we visited. One had had the opportunity to put in basic water infrastructure. The people there, even at a relatively advanced part of the dry season, still had water and were able to irrigate vegetable growing and water their animals, whereas driving literally 10 to 15 minutes away to the villages which had no such infrastructure, we saw health clinics simply overwhelmed by hungry and malnourished women and children. It's a very stark, contrast between what happens with development, which is endeavouring to meet the triple objectives, and where people haven't had that chance. And out of our visit, and really the purpose of our visit, was to say, going forward in the Sahel, can we please coordinate humanitarian and development responses? Because otherwise the ambulance will always be parked at the bottom of the cliff. People want the chance to put the fence at the top of the cliff so that when these severe circumstances strike, they don't just go right over. We do need triple win approaches there. Another area which is very, very rich for this triple win approach is an energy policy. And the UN has designated this year, 2012, as the International Year of Sustainable Energy for All. And with Sustainable Energy for All, you obviously are aiming to reduce the reliance on traditional biomass for cooling and heating, thereby reducing deforestation. Through renewable energy, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Through investment in sustainable energy, you create jobs and livelihoods. And you most definitely, with universal energy access, lessen the burden of domestic chores on women, and you bring benefits for health status, for education and for economic empowerment. And the Secretary-General of the UN has launched an initiative around sustainable energy access for all, which sets some very specific targets. Now, again, there are plenty of amazing examples of countries which have worked to go down this track. And if you take Nepal, going back to 1996, it started in about 5 districts with an initiative for modern energy services for people in remote areas. And it's been based largely around building micro-hydro schemes, which can be quite effective off even a relatively small flow of water. And then, of course, that enabled improved cooking stoves to be introduced in the areas which have benefited from this approach. Household incomes have gone up by about 8% per annum, and the average annual spending on energy per household has fallen from around the $41 the non-electrified households spend down to $19 for those who've been in the scheme. So that started in 5 districts. Nepal has expanded it to all 75 districts, and this kind of approach through micro-hydro is expected to generate around 15% of its electricity. Again, as in Niger, as people saw what was happening in adjacent communities, they wanted to be part of it, and you had tremendous local engagement, local authority engagement, etc. So we are not short of examples of what will work in these kinds of areas. But to achieve a step change, to make such practice around triple win policies the exception, the rule not the exception, a number of things have to happen. The capacity of countries and communities to plan ahead and act needs to be strengthened. Actually, putting some incentives in place can help, and you need to mobilise broad coalitions and partnerships. And Rio+20 can helpfully focus on all these things. So let me talk now about some of these constraints and how one can tackle them. First point I want to make is that funding per se is not necessarily the major constraint on pursuing sustainable development. What matters more is whether or not governments in the first place are willing to embrace these approaches, and whether they and development partners, where relevant, are prepared to invest in the capacity to do that. So on willingness to act, as I said earlier, it's often undermined by short-term political considerations and by perceptions of the upfront costs. But I think at Rio+20 we should also focus on the very heavy costs of doing business as usual and increase appreciation of what a sustainable development approach can do to generate green and inclusive growth and innovation. Interestingly, the OECD has just pronounced that green growth and sustainable development should be incorporated into structural reform agendas, which I find a very interesting concept from OECD. And if we are looking to where the jobs, the innovation, the growth in goods and services and exports for the future can come, I think this is an extremely fertile area to be exploring. So to maintain momentum around promoting best practice, we will be releasing very soon a set of case studies on triple win policies and on how they work in practice. and we're very interested in supporting South-South cooperation to cross-fertilise ideas around these approaches globally. And there is some discussion going on around a possible outcome from Rio Plus 20 being the establishment of a globally recognised knowledge hub on sustainable development, which would foster South-South cooperation, support dialogue and research, broker partnerships and cooperation frameworks, etc. Governments are interested, communities are interested in what each other is doing, so a global platform could be extremely helpful, and certainly if it is an outcome of Rio, UNDP will get right in behind it with our extensive networks and experience of working in these areas. Now, a word on building capacity, and it's a big subject, and I hope it's one that will occupy time at Rio Plus 20. A lot of capacity building and development is needed to pursue low-carbon, climate-resilient approaches to development, and in integrating those approaches with the broad development strategies countries have to reduce poverty, improve educational access, health service access, etc., etc. We work in virtually every developing country on earth on capacity building, and specifically on capacity building around this area, which often will involve training and support for relevant government officials to build scenarios which show how you can achieve the broad development objectives of a country through actions which also have the virtue of reducing current or future carbon emissions or ecosystem depletion. And acting in this role, we aim to work as a broker, helping countries identify and design policies and initiatives which will meet the criteria established for dedicated climate finance. And let me say a word about that, because the likelihood is that climate finance will, in the not so distant future, far exceed the amount of finance that is available through official development assistance. Starting perhaps in a small way, some of the $10 billion per year which developed countries pledged at Copenhagen Climate Summit has been delivered. And overall, we see climate finance, and we're not only talking grants here, we're talking loans and carbon market mechanisms. Climate finance is now accessible through more than 50 international public funds, 60 carbon markets, and some 6,000 private equity funds. Now, if you are a poor country, navigating through that plethora of hoops requires capacity you may not have at all. And that's where we tend to come in. Now, going from the $10 billion a year that was pledged at Copenhagen, by 2020, developed countries have committed to raising $100 billion of climate finance a year. And that will still be the petty cash of the total amount available for climate change adaptation and mitigation. But unless you have the capacity to access this money, it remains truly the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And that has been the case with the funding available under the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, where most of the money has been snatched up by large emerging economies and very, very little has gone to poor countries. So it is absolutely critical that Rio focuses on support for capacity building for sustainable development and being able to access the funding. And if we invest in capacity building, then there's the ability to access the public funding, and from that to leverage into the very, very substantial carbon market, loan and other finance. And I think using official development finance, official development assistance money in a catalytic way to support countries to go down this path is a very good use of ODA. Now, I did mention incentives and disincentives for sustainable development. And let me mention one big area of incentives for unsustainable development, and that is the approximately $1 trillion a year which countries spend on fuel subsidies. Now, getting rid of them, of course, can be politically rather controversial, as Nigeria found recently. But there are ways of doing it, and those ways are to mitigate the impact on lower income families, to make the removal of the subsidies more attractive. So it comes back to basic social protection and the floor that you set for people as minimum standards of living in your society. There's another way that governments could incentivise sustainable development, and that is through their own policies on public procurement. Around the world, governments spend around $5 trillion every year on public procurement. And if they were to adopt sustainable public procurement policies and set standards around that, of course they then incentivise the development for sale of sustainable products and services. Governments have a lot of buying power. When I was Prime Minister of my own country, we were working on exactly such policies and approaches on sustainable procurement. Now, Rio Plus 20, focusing on the global level, does offer an opportunity to strengthen international governance for sustainable development. And our organisation has proposed having a Sustainable Development Council, which could be equipped with a universal periodic review mechanism. It works in human rights, why couldn't it work in sustainable development? Countries could review each other's performance on a voluntary basis across the 3 strands of sustainable development. And this would be a way also of sharing best practice and lessons on how to proceed. And I think that as part of supporting this ongoing reform of the UN development system, for us to coordinate and join up our approaches better is also important, because with the wide range of expertise and depth of expertise that UN agencies, funds and programs have, we are in a position, if we work together, to offer integrated policy services to governments trying to tackle the complexities of sustainable development. So we would certainly like a strong nod from Rio Plus 20 in that direction as well. Rio Plus 20 will discuss sustainable development goals. Now, one could really apply a whole lecture to this subject, and I don't intend to. But the Millennium Development Goals, the time frame for meeting the targets set for them is due to expire in 3 years' time, 2015. Those goals, the MDGs, have been quite successful. I talked a bit about this last night, because they were time-bound, specific, and very easy to communicate. And so they gathered steam. And so many countries have built the MDGs into their national development strategies and cheerfully report against them and take some pride in achievement. So there's what you might describe as a global conversation that is flourishing out there on what would the development agenda, the global development agenda, look like after 2015. And the Rio Plus 20 summit will probably resolve something about the characteristics of what sustainable development goals could be, and it is hoped by us that they would build on the success of the MDGs and link the drive for poverty reduction and social goals with that for environmental sustainability. The MDGs were rather weak on environmental sustainability, but it would be very unfortunate if the SDGs which replaced them were weak on poverty reduction and social goals and equity. So we have to try to find that balance to get a well-crafted development agenda. Next thing that Rio Plus 20 is likely to have an outcome on is how would we actually measure progress on sustainable development? The global panel the SG established said, what you can't measure, you can't manage. Well, there's some truth in that. So it's thought likely that Rio Plus 20 will propel us forward on developing a new Sustainable Development Index, or a set of indicators which could expand on the Human Development Index so that we can measure progress in a way that's transparent. And UNDP intends to run its major side event at Rio on precisely this subject of how would you measure progress on sustainable development. I think the final point to make about Rio Plus 20 is it needs to generate new partnerships and new coalitions for action. Because sustainable development requires such substantial shifts in attitudes across societies, then you need broad constituencies on board, you need broad partnerships. And it is much easier for governments to break out of the short-term thinking which follows political cycles if the society is also propelling them forward. There's active citizen engagement, of the private sector sees the potential of taking a more sustainable course. And there are good champions, in my opinion, in the private sector on this issue. There are others, of course, who may fight it to the end, but we tend to work with those who will provide a lead on these issues. So, to come to my conclusion, achieving sustainable development is obviously a huge challenge, and not only for developing countries. The global north has huge responsibility in this area to reduce its environmental footprint, address its own social fractures, and act in a way which does support the development of the global south. The question that is being posed as the sort of framing question for Rio Plus 20 is, and I quote, what kind of world do we want to live in? What sort of future do we collectively want to choose? And I suppose we all have our own answers to that question. But I would say for myself that I would want to live in a world which is sustainable and much more equitable, where decisions taken at every level are driven by respect for and promotion of people's choices, freedoms and opportunities, while respecting the boundaries of a nation. In a world where the goals we aspire to and plan around are transformational, universal, able to galvanise individual and collective action. And I think that the opportunity of Rio Plus 20 should be taken to design a global development framework beyond 2015 which recommits to equitable and sustainable human development. You have to deal with equity and sustainability together. I think the case for that is very, very clear. And I hope that Rio Plus 20 might prove as motivating as the Earth Summit did in stimulating action and debate around sustainable development. Thank you.